deaths of Laura Lolly Winans and Julianne Julie Williams, two women in a same-sex relationship, shocked the United States back in 1996. The case remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. However, in June 2024, the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) released crucial information regarding the perpetrator of this case. Laura Winans was born in 1970 and grew up in a wealthy family in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. She loved freedom, enjoyed exploring nature, and was always ready for an adventure. Instead of going to college like most people, she found her passion at Unity College in Maine, a school known for its focus on the environment and sustainable development. There, she was trained to become an outdoor guide. She used nature to help troubled teens reconnect with life. Laura Winans was also strong, social, and passionate. She not only excelled in survival skills, but also had strong leadership abilities. She often led youth groups on camping trips and explorations. People were impressed by her intelligence, courage, and independent spirit. Julie Williams was born in 1972 in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and grew up in a middle-class family that valued science and education. She was quiet, thoughtful, and had a deep passion for geology. After graduating from Carleton College in Minnesota with a degree in geology, Julie Williams planned to work in environmental research. She was a reserved person, but very considerate and caring toward others. Julie Williams and Laura Winans met through outdoor activity groups, and they quickly became close due to their shared love for nature. They became a couple, exploring, camping, and sharing a common desire to live in harmony with the natural world. In May 1996, Julianne Julie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans were excited to begin their camping trip at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. This trip wasn't just a typical vacation, but an opportunity for the two to explore nature, relax after busy days, and celebrate their love for each other. Since both of them enjoyed outdoor activities, they chose a quiet area in the park with pristine scenery and little foot traffic. Upon arriving at the park, they decided not to choose the popular campsites, but instead sought a more private location, far from the main trails. This spot was near the Skyland Resort, an area that was quite remote, surrounded by dense forests. During the first few days of their trip, Julie and Lolly spent most of their time exploring the surrounding area. They mostly hiked along the trails, through dense forests and near small streams. Julie used her knowledge of geology to explain the mountain rock formations, while Lolly recorded their experiences in a journal. Later, several suspicious details were discovered. Some campers nearby remembered seeing Julie and Lolly, but they noticed nothing unusual about them in the final days of the trip. After that, it seemed like no one saw them anymore. In the days that followed, Julie and Lolly did not call home or send any messages, which was something they always did when traveling. On May 29, 1996, Julianne Julie Williams' family began to worry as they hadn't heard from her. According to their plans, Julie and Laura Lolly Winans were supposed to return around this time, but they had not been in contact with anyone. The Williams family tried calling Julie, but there was no answer, and they began to feel uneasy. Soon after, they reported Julie and Laura missing to the police, and a large search operation was launched at Shenandoah National Park. Park rangers, police officers, and volunteers began searching the area, focusing on the trails and campsites where Julie and Laura might have gone. However, the area was vast, with dense forests and bad weather, making the search difficult. As no clear signs were found, the search team had to expand their efforts, asking other campers for information and searching more remote areas of the park. On the morning of June 1, 1996, after several days of searching, park rangers at Shenandoah National Park discovered a horrifying scene at a remote campsite near Skyland Resort. In an area with dense trees and little foot traffic, the bodies of Laura Lolly Winans and Julianne Julie Williams were found inside a tent in a heartbreaking condition. Julie and Lolly were bound with ropes, their hands tightly restrained behind their backs, and their mouths were gagged. This indicated that the killer intended to prevent them from calling for help. They were found unclothed, showing signs of brutal torture. Investigators believe they may have been sexually assaulted before being killed. The cause of death was determined to be deep cuts to the neck. The weapon used was sharp, inflicting a fatal wound. This suggested that the killer acted with great cruelty and intent. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene, indicating that the murderer had quickly subdued the victims. Notably, Julie and Lolly's campsite had not been heavily disturbed. Their personal belongings were intact, with only a few items missing, possibly taken by the killer. This led investigators to believe that the murderer was not just after theft, but may have planned the attack in advance. Based on the condition of the bodies and the evidence at the scene, forensic experts suggested that the crime may have occurred several days before the bodies were discovered. No one witnessed the attack, and the location was remote enough for the killer to act without being noticed. Additionally, the investigation gathered a significant amount of crucial evidence. DNA traces were key evidence, with biological samples suspected to belong to the killer found on the victims' bodies, the ropes, and some personal items. Investigators also collected unfamiliar fingerprints on the victims' belongings and a fabric thread that didn't match any of their clothing. The shoe prints didn't match those of the victims, and drag marks on the ground indicated forced movement. The murder weapon was identified as a sharp blade, though it was not found at the scene. Other evidence included personal items that had been disturbed, but no valuable property was taken, suggesting the motive was not simply robbery. The victim's journal also provided important details about their final days. All of this evidence played a crucial role in shedding light on the case and identifying a suspect. The deaths of the two women caused an outcry in society, especially within the LGBTQ+ community. Shortly afterward, a major investigation was launched involving the FBI, Virginia State Police, and park rangers from Shenandoah National Park. Initially, investigators focused on the evidence gathered, such as DNA samples, fingerprints, shoe prints, and other pieces of evidence. However, at the time, forensic technology was not advanced enough, so many of the samples could not be thoroughly analyzed. The initial investigation focused on individuals with a history of violence in the area surrounding the park. Among them, Darrell David Rice quickly became the prime suspect. Rice had been arrested for assaulting women in Shenandoah National Park in 1997, just 1 year after Laura and Julie were killed. Witnesses described Rice as aggressive, frequently harassing women, and particularly hostile toward members of the LGBTQ+ community. He had reportedly made frightening statements like, "I hate lesbian women, I'll kill all of them," leading police to suspect this could be a hate crime. Additionally, Rice's records showed that he frequently visited the park, was familiar with the terrain, and had a history of violent offenses. Police believed he had both the motive and the opportunity to commit the crime, especially since he had previously assaulted a woman alone in the park before his arrest in 1997. With this evidence, in 2002, Rice was charged with murder, and prosecutors believed they had found the killer. However, in 2004, the case took a different turn when DNA test results from the crime scene did not match Rice. The samples collected, including semen, hair, and skin, were not his. This raised the question, was Rice really the murderer? With no evidence proving his involvement, prosecutors had to drop the charges, and he was released. The inability to convict Rice led the investigation to a standstill, and the case became a cold case. Although it was no longer under active public investigation, the FBI continued to gather evidence, review other suspects, and keep DNA samples in the hope that future forensic advancements would help identify the killer. This decision ultimately proved crucial, as more than 2 decades later, the FBI used genetic genealogy technology to uncover the true identity of the murderer. By 2021, with the significant advancement in forensic technology, the FBI decided to reopen the case and retest the DNA samples from the crime scene. This time, they used genetic genealogy, a new method that helps identify criminals through DNA databases of families. Instead of only comparing DNA with criminal records, investigators could trace the suspect's relatives, and from there, uncover the identity of the murderer. This breakthrough led to a shocking discovery. DNA from the crime scene matched that of Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a notorious criminal with a long history of sexual assault, violence, and other serious crimes. Jackson had an extensive criminal record, having been convicted for assaulting and raping multiple women in Ohio. However, at the time of the 1996 case, he was not a suspect, as there was no connection to Shenandoah National Park or the victims. Sadly, Jackson had passed away in prison in 2018, so he never had to face the crimes he committed. However, discovering the killer after more than 25 years still brought a meaningful conclusion to the case. For the victims' families, although they couldn't see the murderer punished, they finally got the answers they had been seeking after years of living in pain and uncertainty. The FBI also stated that finding Jackson could help solve other unsolved cases. Investigators are reviewing his criminal records to see how many more victims he may have harmed. The use of advanced forensic techniques in this case not only helped close a decades-old case, but also brought hope to many similar cases. In the late 1970s, Ventura County in California faced a series of unsolved murder cases. This left a dark mark in the region's history. Among them, the deaths of 3 women in a short period, all killed in the same manner, created public panic. The simultaneous occurrence of several such events led the police force to believe that a cold-blooded serial killer was hiding in the area, targeting vulnerable women in the community. As time passed with no progress made, the cases gradually faded into obscurity. However, the evidence was carefully preserved, waiting for advancements in forensic technology that could unlock the truth. It wasn't until a major breakthrough occurred that the fates of the 3 women were tragically linked together, revealing a dark and bloody crime story that had been buried for over 50 years. In the 1970s, California was not only the dream destination for many Americans, but also the birthplace of a terrifying wave of crime. Crime rates surged at an alarming pace, and the rise of criminal gangs shook society. Drugs spread throughout the regions, and drug trafficking and use became a serious issue, bringing with it a wave of unrelenting violence. The police were under immense pressure as violent crime rates increased, with murders, rapes, and assaults occurring frequently, overshadowing the sense of safety among the public. Society was plunged into fear as a series of brutal crimes unfolded without explanation. The consecutive murders and seemingly endless violence left the public increasingly anxious and losing trust in the police force. The first victim in the case was discovered on May 29, 1977. The haunting body of an 18-year-old girl, lifeless, was found in a small motel room in Port Hueneme. She was found lying on the bed, her eyes devoid of life, and her neck strangled by her own underwear, an incredibly disturbing method that horrified everyone. The brutal signs of the crime indicated that the perpetrator was a ruthless and cold-blooded killer. This raised questions about a possible connection between this case and other unsolved crimes in the area. After investigation, it was confirmed that the girl was Kimberly Fritz from Ann Arbor, Michigan, who had recently arrived in California. Initially, the murder was considered an isolated case, unrelated to any other incidents in the area. The investigating police felt there was something unusual about the way the victim had been killed, but they couldn't yet envision a more complex series of linked cases. However, as more cases began to surface, criminal experts began to realize that Kimberly's death was truly just the beginning of a much darker chain of events. Just a few months after Kimberly Fritz's death, on September 9, 1977, Velvet Sanchez, a 31-year-old woman, became the next victim of this brutal killer. Velvet was a strong woman who had recently resigned from the U.S. Naval Exchange. Her body was found in a motel in Oxnard, California, strangled in the same manner as Kimberly. This not only left investigators bewildered, but also sparked fear as the similarities between the cases became too clear to ignore. She had been strangled with her own underwear, a signature method that the perpetrator had used in the previous murder. Velvet, like the other victims, became part of a crime spree that was leaving the community in fear, and the police began to realize that there might be a serial killer on the loose. Velvet Sanchez's death raised serious questions about a criminal who couldn't stop and highlighted a heartbreaking truth. The public began to fear, doubt, and stay alert, but once again the killer managed to escape capture. Shortly after, in December of the same year, Lorraine Rodriguez, a mother of 2 young children who would do anything to ensure her children had a good life, became the 3rd victim in this chain of murders. Lorraine's body was discovered on the side of Laguna Road, a stretch near Oxnard, where police found her strangled in the same way as the previous victims. The wounds on her neck showed that the killer once again used her own underwear to end her life. Lorraine's death further emphasized that this killer was indiscriminate, not caring about age or circumstance. Each victim, regardless of their life story, was brutally and inexplicably ended. 3 murders within 1 year, with almost identical methods of killing, fueled suspicion that a serial killer was operating in the area. Investigators noticed that not only was the method of strangulation with underwear similar, but the location of the bodies and the arrangement also showed disturbing similarities. These murders began to raise significant concerns for the community and the police as they realized the killer might have a much darker goal in mind, making California streets no longer a safe place for anyone. After connecting the cases of Kimberly, Velvet, and Lorraine, the police quickly recognized the terrifying similarities between the murders. All 3 victims were women, murdered by strangulation with their own underwear, a clear sign of the brutality and deliberate nature of the perpetrator. Moreover, their bodies were not only physically destroyed, but also arranged in the same identical position, indicating that the killer had a distinct psychological element in carrying out the murders. These specific traits were too characteristic to be mere coincidences. In early 1978, based on these details, Dr. Ronald Kornblum, the forensic pathologist at the time, did not hesitate to conclude that all 3 murders were committed by a serial killer. However, the investigation still faced many obstacles. While the elements in the cases seemed closely linked, the evidence began to show signs of discrepancies, raising questions that needed answers. Some differences in the small details of the killer's method, particularly in Lorraine Rodriguez's case, made the police reconsider the theory that all 3 murders were committed by the same perpetrator. While Lorraine's death shared similarities with the previous 2 victims, small details, such as the position of the body and other traces at the crime scene, began to suggest the possibility of multiple perpetrators being involved. These contradictions made it harder than ever to identify the killer. Another factor complicating the investigation was the victims' living circumstances. Kimberly, Velvet, and Lorraine were all women who led difficult lives. They did not choose prostitution as a career, but simply as a means to survive in the society of that time. The fact that all 3 women worked in the sex industry created a thick wall of stigma, turning them into forgotten victims in the eyes of the public and the media. They were not seen as worthy of attention or deserving of protection, but were simply labeled as girls leading temporary, unstable lives and being vulnerable. This prejudice caused their cases to become cold and invisible, receiving little attention from the media and the public. Despite their tragic and painful fates, their stories were buried under a layer of indifference and social bias. The witnesses to the case, many of whom lived in circumstances similar to the victims, were too afraid to come forward with information, fearing judgment or legal repercussions. As a result, even when the police began to recognize the connection between the murders, despite the disturbing similarities in the killing methods, the lack of strong evidence and the complexity of the victims' lives caused the cases to remain stalled. Nevertheless, the case was not forgotten. Despite the lack of information and evidence slowing down the investigation, making little progress, the mysterious traces from the crime scenes still haunted the investigators. The common features in the killer's method, from strangulation with underwear to the unusual positioning of the bodies, were details that could not be overlooked. The police continued searching for connections between the murders, despite the investigation being stalled several times due to the lack of evidence. The investigative methods gradually became more complex as authorities faced the task of analyzing old data from similar cases to see if there were any connections. They had to continuously re-examine old evidence, from small traces at the crime scenes to potential crime patterns that could help identify the perpetrator. But every time things seemed to be getting closer to a solution, a new development would emerge, forcing them to start over. In reality, after months of investigation with little progress, a great sense of frustration began to grow among the investigators. A strong suspicion that this killer would continue to commit other crimes in the future kept them from giving up. Even though the traces were faint, they remained important clues that brought the investigators closer to unraveling the mystery surrounding the case. With every new lead, every small detail uncovered, even if it didn't provide immediate results, it created a sense of hope that one day the killer would have to pay for the horrific crimes he had committed. The long months didn't cause the case to fade into obscurity, but only made it a greater mystery, driving the police to continue searching for answers. It wasn't until July 6, 1992, when the case of Nona Stami in North Carolina became a crucial link in the chain of unsolved cases. When Nona Stami's case was discovered in 1985, the police started to notice a suspicious similarity to the previous cases. Nona Stami, a 27-year-old woman, was murdered in her home in Charlotte, North Carolina. And just like the earlier victims, she was strangled with her own underwear. This method of murder prompted investigators to pay attention and compare it to the unsolved cases. At first, Nona Stami's murder wasn't immediately linked to the cases of the women in California due to the significant geographical distance and time gap. Nona's case, though showing signs of a brutal murder, wasn't strong enough to highlight clear connections to the previous cases. Each murder had its own unique characteristics, and while there was a similarity in the method of the killings, there wasn't enough direct evidence for the police to conclude that all the cases were committed by the same perpetrator. However, as investigators began to gather and analyze evidence from the crime scene of Nona's case, things began to change. DNA testing from the crime scene of Nona Stami created a new direction for the investigation, opening up a possibility that no one had previously considered. Samples collected from the scene, including hair and tissue, were sent for analysis at a forensic laboratory. At that time, DNA testing was still a relatively new technology in criminal investigations and had only been applied in a few major cases. However, investigators realized that this could be the key to solving this challenging case. This was perhaps the first significant breakthrough in solving Nona Stami's case. Although DNA testing was not as widely used as it is today, forensic experts worked tirelessly to analyze the DNA samples collected from the crime scene. This not only confirmed the basic elements of the case, but also marked a major step forward in connecting previously unsolved murder cases. When police entered the DNA data related to Nona Stami's case into the national database, the surprising result showed a match with Warren Luther Alexander. He had a criminal history of violent behavior and had been investigated in similar cases, but had never been arrested due to lack of evidence. He was currently a suspect in the murder of Nona Cobb. This match was a shocking revelation for the police. In March 2022, Warren Luther Alexander was arrested in Mississippi, where he was living, on charges related to the Nona Cobb case in North Carolina and the murders in California. He was suspected of being a serial killer targeting women working in prostitution and living transient lives. The arrest was made through the collaboration of the FBI, Ventura County Sheriff's Office, and local law enforcement agencies. It not only helped solve Nona Stami's case, but also represented a crucial step in solving unsolved cases in California. With the initial charges, Alexander was accused of murder, sexual assault, and other violent crimes. The initial charges focused on the Nona Cobb case, but later expanded to include the murders in California. The trial is scheduled to begin on August 21, 2024, at the Ventura County Superior Court in California. He has pleaded not guilty and is currently being held without bail. After the trial, the Ventura County District Attorney's Office decided not to pursue the death penalty, instead seeking a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This decision was made to ensure the legal process moved swiftly, particularly since the witnesses and evidence were decades old. Investigators are continuing to explore whether Alexander is connected to other cases, particularly unsolved murders along highways in the U.S. Currently, Alexander is being held at the Ventura County Jail, awaiting trial.